when we started Morning Consult, it wasn't supposed to be a company. So the idea of being here at First Tuesday, almost 10 or 12 years from being a student at one of these tables, is really quite an honor. I remember actually being here with John Stavig with the Pentair CEO. So it's kind of, I guess, coincidental that I think next month's speaker is the Pentair CEO or the rebrand of Pentair. But Pentair, if you're looking for any branding advice, my co-founder Kyle Drops right here. Hopefully you guys are laughing, hopefully you're engaging. I want this to be a conversation, and I want to save room for the Q&A. I'm excited to talk to you guys about my experience at the University of Minnesota and specifically the Carlson School, a little bit about what we're building at Morning Consult. The dean did a tremendous job of kind of outlining some of the key pieces, and then I think the majority of the conversation is going to really focus on understanding Gen Z. Generation Z are today's college students. They really are a fickle segmentation for most companies. So those of you that are in major executive roles looking at sort of consumer-facing products, this is really first and foremost on your priority list. But the dean mentioned it, the University of Minnesota and the Carlson School has played a tremendous role in my life. I want to thank a couple folks. I know she mentioned the relationship with John and Steve Parenti. I was really lucky to step foot on campus around the same time that John was leading the home center. I met John, I was very precocious. I thought I knew a lot more than I knew. And John did an incredible job of putting up with me for 4 years. He'd take me to lunch, he'd take me to coffee, and I just owe a tremendous amount of gratitude to John for taking interest in me at such a young age. I think for all of you that look at mentorship as sort of in that moment, I think you sometimes lose track of the fact that it might take 10, 15, 20 years for some of those mentees to fully grasp what you're trying to encourage them to think about. And so I think for me, when I came to the university, I think like a lot of young, high-achieving students, I was very interested in titles and awards, and I think I really credit John for really helping to focus a little bit more on what you're actually doing, and more importantly, who you're doing it with. And so I want to thank John. That was an incredible experience for me when I was at the university. Phil Miller, who's now the assistant dean, was actually the head of the Carlson Consulting Enterprise. I was really lucky to commandeer Phil's office. Whenever he left at about 7 or 8 o'clock in the evening, I would then conveniently take his office and make it my office. It was there that really I started thinking about some of the things that eventually became the media platform for the company. But Phil was tremendous in helping me think about sort of non-traditional routes and encouraging some of the things that happened in my career in Washington, D.C. Professor Kay Husbands-Feeling, who's no longer at the university, she's at Georgia Tech now, but had joined the Humphrey faculty, really tremendous influence on me in terms of thinking about the role of industry analysis and regulation, how companies engage in Washington, D.C. And then as the dean noted, Steve has played a tremendous role in my life and is a very close friend. He and I could do the Wells Fargo promo on setting up a small business banking account. I still remember not actually knowing how to set up a business, which isn't an indictment of the school, but maybe something that I should have learned when I was there. So fortunately, Steve had taken me to the local Wells Fargo branch, and we are very grateful that we learned how to set up a bank account. But my experience in Minnesota and really Morning Consult wasn't supposed to build a company. I showed up at Steve's doorstep. I thought I wanted to do a PhD, and I understood that you had to have faculty advisors to help get into a program, and I wanted to have a writing sample that showed more analytical rigor. And so I showed up at Steve's doorstep, and I told him he was going to be my friend. I told him I was going to save him an hour a week, and that he was going to spend it on me. It wasn't so much asking, but more of a presentation. And so we'll see if our laser pointer works here or not. But the example here on the left, healthcare news clippings, the date. That was my effort to save Steve an hour a week. It was not supposed to be a company. I ran out of Word, Excel, and Outlook. It was a very sophisticated technology company at that time. God bless Google Reader. But what was really powerful about it for me was that it got me thinking about industry and information and how, in this case, it was 2009. That's actually dated from October 2020. 2009, yeah. So I started this in March of 2009. It wasn't named. It was basically just a way for me to think and learn about the industry. And the healthcare industry in particular at that time with the ACA legislation was in a very dynamic place. And I think what I learned more than anything was that for especially industries like healthcare, you need to start to understand what was going on in the political landscape, the policy landscape, the finance landscape, and the business strategy landscape, because each one of those dynamics for an industry was going to shape the outcome of changes to that industry. What it's become, and this is an example actually from yesterday of Morning Consult Health, there's over 300,000 subscribers to the media platform. We have 22 full-time reporters. They're credentialed with the White House and congressional press galleries. Our current editor-in-chief is a former correspondent for the New York Times Deal Book. Really just a tremendous outcome of what was supposed to be a way to keep your thesis advisor engaged. Which he had awesome open rates all the time. But if you think about it, for a senior thesis to be where we are today, a lot had to have happened. So this is just a little bit of a timeline of events here in the last 10 years and a little bit about where we're going. So I started with Healthcare News Clippings: The Date. It wasn't supposed to be a company. I ended up moving to Washington, D.C. to work for a management consulting firm in the healthcare space. I was fortunate enough to have a reader ask me to co-publish a piece in a healthcare journal called Health Affairs, and I realized I should probably name this something. So I went through a medical terms dictionary, and I was trying to find like daily, like morning modifiers for like the frequency. And then I was trying to find healthcare terms to describe it. So like, thank God it wasn't the daily dose or like the daily prescription. Morning Consult, the very first survey, and this at the time was not the intended outcome of the newsletter, was essentially a reader survey of these modifiers. And the wisdom of crowds ended up choosing Consult as sort of the generic description of it. Didn't really think about it as a company. 2011, 2012, I was really lucky. One of my co-founders is here with me today, Kyle Drop. And Kyle had just finished his dissertation at Stanford, and he was showing me very much focused on kind of what the future of mobile and online research needed to look like. He worked on the Washington Post ABC News poll. I, being an enterprising business student, realized that his idea was worth a lot of money and had greater ambitions for his idea maybe than the 12 people who were going to read his dissertation. Thankfully, we combined our views of the world, and the idea was originally, what if you marry a media platform with the survey research technology? So keep in mind, around this time, 2008 was sort of the ultimate low point in survey research. You had real problems with the presidential election. You had this evolution in how Americans engage with surveys. So it was live telephone and it was landline homes that you would typically get like the Gallup survey from. And the problem is that you saw a precipitous drop in landline penetration at the same time that culturally people stopped answering phone calls from random numbers. That doesn't mean that people don't need survey or market research. It just means that that mode or that methodology is increasingly outdated. So kind of right time, right place. Kyle and I started talking about this as an idea, and I had this newsletter, and it was getting to be 10,000 people that I'd enter into an Excel spreadsheet, and I'd use Google Groups to bypass spam filters. And John Campbell was joking, I think he was among the first 100 people on the list. And we started to think, well, what if you were going to think about it as a media company? Well, you need to create content. And how do you create content? At that time, you had like the Vox, the BuzzFeed type model to creating listicles or cat GIFs. And we just didn't think that was going to work for our healthcare industry coverage. And so we had this idea, well, what if you marry the survey research technology with a newsroom? You could create original content that would be of interest to business executives, government executives, and healthcare. And so kind of 2013 presented this perfect storm where the health exchanges were going to go live October 1st. And Kyle and I had taken 30K in angel capital. We had figured out how to open a Wells Fargo bank account. And what we wanted to do was a 2,000 person survey that was in a mobile and online environment. And so mobile and online, the sort of early knock on it was that it's harder to reach older respondents because there's just not as many online. But with the health exchanges, the whole focus of that from a policy or business perspective was, were the young and uninsured going to sign up for health insurance coverage? And so we basically bet the farm on building a basic WordPress website and releasing a survey of 2,000 people, traditionally a 1,000-person survey. With 2,000 people, you could look at the young and uninsured. And so thank God we released it the day before the health exchanges went live. We wrote up the stories ourselves. I think it's actually the only author bylines that Kyle and I have. And we released the survey, and the next thing that we know, the White House led their afternoon briefing with a morning consult survey. And 2 weeks later, a Fortune 500 healthcare company sent us a $168,000 check to buy out that pool for each month of open enrollment. And that was the beginning of the company. So for students that are in the venture space or looking to launch companies, or anyone at any age looking to launch companies, the way to build an emerging technology company isn't always going to Andreessen Horowitz and asking for $20 million. I think that's societally something that, like, when we look at entrepreneurship and those things, that we should talk more openly about. Is there's a lot of different ways to start companies and grow businesses. And we were really lucky that kind of right time, right place for the technology. But we didn't officially start the company until January 1, and I kind of used that official start date because we had an employee on January 1st. At that point, Kyle was a Dartmouth professor. I still had a day job. And we launched out of a DC row home. So this is like very unexpected beginnings. We convinced our then general counsel and kind of jack of all trades to move in. We actually didn't tell him that we were going to launch the business out of the home. We just told him that we figured out his housing. And then we had to kick him out of the house 6 months later because we needed the space for more desks. So needless to say, the neighborhood is a little confused about what was going on at that row home. But it really took off. In 2015, this is getting a little jargony, but we launched our first programmatic bidding system. So this will make more sense and cover a lot of the Gen Z and why we can talk about companies that we can. If you think about survey research, Web 1.0 was like SurveyMonkey or YouGov, was sort of build your panel, and you can go ask questions of this group of online participants. And the problem with that is they could never get enough scale. So like today, like I think YouGov has a 2.5 million person panel in the US. And that sounds like a lot, but not if you want to have representative samples in the state of South Dakota or in Alaska or in Hawaii, or not if you want to talk to different people all the time. And so what was really, I think, novel about our company at that point was we looked at it like high frequency traders looking at the stock market, which was to say that why would you pay for an individual one static rate no matter what? Like if you were going to do a live telephone call, the person on the other, or the company on the other end of that call is making about $15 for your 20 minutes. If you were going to do an online survey at that time, it would be about $4 to complete that survey. And we looked at it and said, well, why would you pay $4 for a woman in the Western census region between 18 and 29 making between 50 and 100K with a bachelor's degree? It turns out there's actually a lot more of those women online than undereducated men in the Midwest over 65 making less than 50K. There's fewer of those online. So kind of supply and demand dynamics there. The idea was, well, what if you programmatically stitch together a set of panels? So today, and I'll talk about it in a second, we have 157 panels globally. We have access to over 100 million people, and we're able to acquire an interview at a much lower rate. And so we could start to think about things differently. So in 2016, we really focused on the presidential election. Kyle and the team was really focused on trying to explain why mobile and online research was the future. And Donald Trump actually presents the perfect use case, which is to say that there are people who have an opinion about the president that are not willing to tell that opinion to another live human being. So in December 2015, it was actually 2 days after I made my best decision in life, which was to get married to a much smarter wife. We were on national television. Kyle made his debut talking about how if you did a 3,000 person survey and you randomize how people take the survey and you control for that population, there was a 6 to 8 point difference between what someone was willing to say about voting for Trump to a live human being on the other end of a telephone than to the anonymity, or quote unquote anonymity, of a machine. And so that really kick-started our space in the political forecasting area. We nailed the national popular vote within 0.7%. The New York Times shifted their survey work to us. So for the Times, there's a lot of cultural kind of focus areas. Politico's obviously focused on politics. Bloomberg, more kind of business strategy issues. What's the future of space, from tourism to colonization? Our hardest hitting work, bar none, is for the Hollywood Reporter. Is Die Hard a Christmas movie? Only 1 in 3 Americans agree. I know all of you in Gen X are vehemently upset about that. And then in 2017, what we really were trying to pioneer in 16 was this idea of going every single day asking surveys of representative samples in the United States, because we realized that very few companies had real-time insight on what consumers were thinking or customers were thinking. And so we launched our ability to do daily tracking in 2017. We asked questions related to advertising, brands, economics, so consumer sentiment or expectations around inflation, entertainment. We have a lot of hard-hitting work in that space, and then political tracking. In 2018, we expanded internationally. So we actually go daily in 12 countries: the UK, France, Germany, Japan, India, China, Canada, Mexico, Brazil, Russia, and Australia. We operate actually globally now in 40 countries. So in 2019, we're on pace. We'll do over 7 million interviews this year in 25 countries, working on over $40 million worth of contracted value with over 250 major brands. So it's everyone from the Googles and the Facebooks of the world to the BarkBoxes and Rent the Runways of the world. And what's exciting about the capability and the technology is that it's used in so many different ways. And I think this is true of where most companies are currently going or need to go, which is sort of this data-informed decision-making. And it's not just data for the sake of data. It's data aligned with actual decisions about how executives are going to make product calls or customer experience evaluations, or how the federal government's going to look at different programs. So what we're building at Morning Consult really solves one core problem, which is that executives don't have a way to collect, organize, and share credible data on what people think in real time. If you looked at like 1986 HBR, it's going to be a focus on like Procter & Gamble doing a 1,000-person survey once a quarter. And that just no longer is reflective of how fast information moves in society, how fast decision makers at companies have to make calls on decisions. And I think the credibility piece is what everyone's sort of been searching for since this evolution from live telephone phone work or survey work to mobile and online. People tried to suffice this with like Twitter monitoring or social media listening is kind of the colloquial term for it, or news media monitoring. The problem with that is Twitter's not a representative sample of the population. If you leave this discussion with no other takeaways than that, please, do not make decisions based on Twitter. Twitter's not a representative sample of the country. The people who tweet are even less representative. It just, at the end of the day, is really concerning that companies actually do that. And you think about it like news media coverage, like the average CEO that gets upset about a Wall Street Journal op-ed, and it's like, well, listen, it's not 1984 anymore. Like, there's more than 6 national newspapers, and the actual readership of the op-ed page, like you're one of the last people who subscribes to the newspaper. Like, there's just real issues with how you evaluate information. And I think we looked at it and were surprised that people weren't asking questions every day. And so that's what we really tried to solve for, which is this idea that you had to have the scale, so you had to have a lot of people that you could potentially focus on. So we want representative samples by age, by income, by ethnicity, by education, by region of the country, by gender. And so it's almost like we're running 36 mini auctions in every country where we operate. And we'll do over 15 to 20,000 interviews a day. It's not enough to collect a lot of data. That was kind of our lessons, kind of 1 through year 3. You have to be able to visualize it. And I think we used to always joke, you really need pretty pictures. And so our whole focus was on how do you make information more accessible to executives. And that's really the second point, which if you think about it, if we're doing 15 to 20,000 interviews, think about it like a spreadsheet. So every row is a person. Every question we ask them on a daily basis is a column. There's 6.5 trillion cells in that spreadsheet, and it needs to process every single night at 1 a.m. East Coast time. It needs to process not just off of US Census data, but off of Chinese census data or World Bank data or the OECD data sets. And so the really powerful thing about the software is the ability to process that and then visualize it. And the third thing was that credibility. And that's where we looked at building a newsroom. I never raised institutional capital when we launched because I would have walked in and tried to explain why we're investing in media. And today, investing in media is not something you generally start your pitch with. And from our standpoint, the goal for us was credibility, and the easiest way to go to market was to demonstrate how the platform can be used. So we looked actually at Bloomberg. Michael Bloomberg writes about how they launched their media operation, and God bless them, because they had to both talk about how they're inventing a computer and then explain how media was going to go on to the computer. We basically just had to start creating content with the data, and over time we were able to build these really strong media partnerships and build our own newsroom. And that's really what our focus was. So when people work with us, they tend to work with us really first and foremost with the intelligence platform. So that's kind of our Bloomberg terminal of public opinion and market research data. We do over 15,000 interviews a day. We cover those different areas I was talking about. And what it allows us to do is really start to dive into data at a granular level. So in this case, Gen Z, I think, is very much sort of apt for this audience and for the university and really the future of post-secondary education. But if I look at this, just as a reminder here, we have a very different set of experiences across different generations. So with baby boomers, kind of 1946 to 1964, the prosperous generation, the Vietnam War, JFK assassination, all kind of major events. Gen X, we probably should have thrown grunge up there, but like fall of the Berlin Wall, the Challenger explosion, some of the key events, the MTV generation. Millennials, which is what Kyle and I would fall into, kind of digital natives. Like we joke a lot in the company about the divide between our younger staff and our older staff. And our older staff, this is very limited in its range, but our older staff remembers the sound of a modem. They remember how disappointing it was when Napster failed to illegally download your song. They understand what AIM was and how much AOL squandered in every internet trend literally ever made. Whereas our Gen Z staff or staff that are just now graduating from college, they're mobile natives, and their key moments, for the millennials, very much the Great Recession, September 11th. You see this in their outlook and their politics. You certainly see it in terms of some of the economic data around savings in that generation and overall income. Gen Z, mobile native. So March for Our Lives, which unfortunately related to the Parkland shooting, Black Lives Matter. These are the events that are shaping that worldview. At a high level, if I wanted to kind of describe today, what are the defining traits of Gen Z? They're motivated. They're motivated having a successful career. They see making money as an important goal. They have a social conscience to that effort. Certainly those of you in the university and education setting, I'm sure, come across this on a daily basis. Companies are trying to adapt to this, which is they tend to be more socially conscious. So kind of predominantly liberal at this point. We'll see sort of how they age and go through other life events in terms of their political proclivity. And then thirdly, and this is probably the most important and I think very much shines through in terms of decision making, is they're very individualistic. So Gen Z adults are likely to value traits like their individual traits over personal identity in terms of what they do versus who they are. And you can see this kind of the events that shape their lives. I'm going to show you in the next slide kind of what specifically the individual traits. But mass shootings and the Trump and Obama elections really become the defining touchstones. Black Lives Matter also up there. Whereas for millennials, a little bit more focused. September 11th, I think, writ large still has resonance in these generations. The Iraq War, financial crisis, a little bit higher with millennials. But when we look at kind of their political identity, deeply disengaged from politics and deeply distrustful of traditional institutions. This should be overwhelmingly concerning to social scientists. 78% of Gen Z says there's a lot of corruption in America. You can see this on the political rhetoric on both sides. 8% have a lot of trust that people in power generally do the right thing. 53% agree that people who work hard and play hard by the rules generally get ahead in America. That's 8 points lower than older generations. 8% say they're paying very close attention to national politics. So it really is this interesting dichotomy. This is looking at personal identity, so that career and hobbies, gender, sexual orientation, a little bit higher on the list. I think notably here, your college, your politics, your social class, your high school, much lower in terms of what Gen Z says are the most important things and how they define themselves. If I look at this in comparison to other generations, the biggest change here that stands out is that they just don't identify in the same way as being American as core to their identity. I think anyone with kids who are aspiring Instagram influencers probably realize careers, hobby, and clothing style comes together on the platform. Sexual orientation, religion, a little bit different here in terms of what it means in terms of personal identity compared to older generations. In terms of ambitions, this making money, having a successful career really stands out compared to having a family, having close friends. We'll see how that changes. I think the having close friends piece, if you look at some of the larger psychological evaluation on anxiety and other issues within this generation, stands out. But I think from our standpoint, it is encapsulated into one statistic. 23% of Gen Z say they want to be famous, compared to 15% of millennials, 8% of Gen Xers, and 3% of baby boomers. Kyle and I are debating this on the way over from the airport. Is it because baby boomers don't think they can be famous again, or they just didn't want to be famous? But it definitely seems like there's a stark contrast there. And it seems like this is increasingly reflective of how people get their information and what people define as famous. We did a big study looking at Saturday Night Live and the hosts. And you think about like Saturday Night Live in the 80s, the 90s, the 2000s, you were able to identify sort of like who were broad-based entertainers. And I'll show this to you an example here in a second about influencers in general, but you could find like somebody to host Saturday Night Live that most people had heard of. And they knew what they were in, or they knew what they sang. That's incredibly hard to do today. The fragmentation in where Gen Z gets information is very different. Right now, over half of Gen Z get their news primarily from social media. Juxtapose this with baby boomers. So 15% of Gen Z says they get their news from television, 45% say social media. Inverse of boomers. 45% of boomers say that they get their information from television, 15% from social media. We're not even getting our information in the same places, and begin to think about how challenging that has to be for companies. When we look at it a little bit further, a day in the life, the brands Gen Z uses most on a daily basis. Remember, they're the mobile first generation. Almost all of the platforms are mobile specific. Netflix being probably mobile in the sense they can watch it on a phone or a tablet, but it's still also in your living room. Compare that on the right side here, the 10 brands Gen Z adults are most likely to use on a daily basis relative to older generations. So things like Snapchat, Instagram. I don't think older generations know that when they text on an iPhone, it's Apple iMessage, but you guys can educate the population. Spotify, YouTube. It's stark in terms of you have two different ways that people are living very different lives right now in society from a consumer habit standpoint. One platform in particular is now emerged as the very first sort of Gen Z platform. You know, a lot of the talk in Washington or writ large is about Facebook or Google or Amazon, or in the social like platform sense like Snapchat and Twitter. Snap definitely has huge high penetration levels with Gen Z, Instagram as well. But what I think stands out is actually TikTok. Most of you probably have never heard of TikTok. I'm gonna actually age my own self here, which is stuff to do on the stage. I thought when I first heard of TikTok, they were talking about Bloomberg on Twitter. That is not actually TikTok. TikTok is a social media platform really kind of distinguished by a lot of videos and memes from younger generations. But look at the difference here between the use once a day among Gen Z versus millennials. So you're even starting to see that shift within those two generations. The other thing that you're going to hear a lot about in the news, especially going forward with increasing tensions between Washington and Beijing, TikTok is the very first social media platform that is owned by a Chinese company. They were the largest ad spenders on Facebook and on Instagram and on Snapchat over the last year. It is going to be a big conversation around not only privacy in the sense of what companies have, but now you're talking about foreign-owned companies with information on what Gen Z is doing, or writ large in the US population. In terms of consumer habits, this fragmentation, like I was saying before, in terms of like who's the right SNL host, we had done a survey, in this case, of just 1,000 Gen Z adults and asked them who were the most influential influencers. I'm going to guess most of this room doesn't know who Jeffree Star is, James Carl, Tati Westbrook. Most of these individuals it's all unaided, so this is identified by the respondent. Those are totally different individuals. Last year, Jeffree Star made $16 million doing demos on YouTube related to makeup and other lifestyle decisions. I don't know if you guys have followed this space with like child influencers, if you guys have kids or grandkids. There's like a kid who opens presents on YouTube that makes $26 million a year. Has his own like toy line. So if you just think about like the challenges for brands, if you have this sort of uncertainty among what one generation thinks versus another, the fragmentation of channels, you can understand how much harder the marketing and communication strategy is. And it's not just that like you might get it wrong and the product doesn't sell as well. You might get it wrong and be absolutely ridiculed on those platforms. So in this case, 34% of Gen Z says that they've shared online memes mocking a company and their actions. So this is, again, like that sort of responsiveness and the ability to understand what's going on in real time heightens, I think, the challenge for CEOs, for CMOs, for executives across the enterprise. From that standpoint, it's not something that is new. This is well reported. Legacy brands are struggling to make inroads with Gen Z. And it started with millennials. It's been exacerbated with Gen Z. A couple of these headlines, Business Insider, I feel like Gen Z and millennials have gotten like accused of killing everything. But in this case, like it really is an evolution of how companies think about themselves. We were talking before about Campbell's Soup. The differences between millennials and Gen Z is stark. I've grabbed an example here for General Mills. I remember getting free Cheerios for any of you that are alums. I feel like that's like half of your like dietary staple is the free samples at Carlson to make sure you have breakfast. But in this case, Gen Z, less than half of Gen Z has a favorable view of General Mills. 30% of Gen Z doesn't even know what General Mills is. 16%, or 1 in 6, have heard of it but have no opinion. Those tend to be men who say they've heard of things but never actually heard of them. Turns out if you ask surveys a lot, you run social experiments a lot, men like to say they know things they don't know, shocking. Women prefer to acknowledge they don't know it, but when forced to choose, women guess more correctly. So just keep that in mind when you think about everyone's decision making or when you see a survey. Gen Z in this case, obviously problematic, not just for General Mills. This is an issue for CPG writ large. I just wanted to have a local example here. Boomers, Gen X, or even millennials, just a totally different composition for the brands. I could do this across almost every segment for every iconic brand. This should absolutely terrify every single executive, and if it's not coming up on earnings calls, it will in the next 18 months. I mean, you could look at any number of automakers right now that are dealing with this in the future of mobility. What I want to show you here, so we ask surveys in a mobile and online environment. What's really exciting about that is we can do things that aren't just traditionally audible questions. So what's nice is in a mobile and online environment, you read faster than you can listen to somebody say a question and respond. So you have time to think about it. We think there's a higher level of thoughtfulness that goes in the surveys. We actually ask attentiveness questions. Like Kyle created a fake radio station in Juneau, Alaska. If you say you listen to that fake radio station in Juneau, Alaska, you get exited out of the survey. If you say you like work on a Boeing plane every day, but you don't identify working in the aviation industry, you get exited out of the survey. So what's nice is you're able to ensure this sort of level of attentiveness, but it also allows us to introduce stimuli. So actually the very first viral study we ever did, when Russia invaded Ukraine, we put a world map in and we asked people to click on the world map where they thought Ukraine was. And then we ran a regression analysis about what type of intervention you want to take. Turns out the less you knew about where Ukraine was in the world, the more likely you were to want to invade. That ended up on Colbert and in the Washington Post. But this is about to show you the idea that you can introduce advertising into these surveys. So instead of like 12 people in a focus group, you're now looking at 2,000 people in which they're able to move their dials, so like the left and right arrow keys on a keyboard, or if you're taking the survey on your phone, a dial comes up and you move it left. If you have a negative impression of what you see, you move it right. If you have a positive impression of what you see. What it's going to show you here, within 12 hours of the Nike Kaepernick ad debuting on the NFL kickoff, we did 2,000 interviews in a partnership with Ad Age and released that data that next morning. Their stock price moved 3 points within the first 6 hours of trading. This is going to show you how dramatic the difference is by age demographics in terms of their response to the overall ad. It's important to know that like if you're in a situation like General Mills or any iconic American brand, you're now faced with this very difficult decision of how do you reach Gen Z to continue to establish the brand with the next generation of consumers at the same time that you risk alienating some of your core consumers that have actively bought the product for upwards of 40 years. And I think this is a really good emblematic situation in terms of what these types of advertisers face.
If people say your dreams are crazy, if they laugh at what you think you can do, good. Stay that way. Because what non-believers fail to understand is that calling a dream crazy is not an insult. It's a compliment. Don't try to be the fastest runner in your school or the fastest in the world. Be the fastest ever. Don't picture yourself wearing OBJ's jersey. Picture OBJ wearing yours. Don't settle for homecoming queen or linebacker. Do both. Lose 120 pounds and become an Ironman after beating a brain tumor. Don't believe you have to be like anybody to be somebody. If you're born a refugee, don't let it stop you from playing soccer for the national team at age 16. Don't become the best basketball player on the planet. Be bigger than basketball. Believe in something, even if it means sacrificing everything. When they talk about the greatest team in the history of the sport, make sure it's your team. If you have only one hand, don't just watch football, play it at the highest level. And if you're a girl from Compton, don't just become a tennis player. Become the greatest athlete ever. Yeah, that's more like it. So don't ask if your dreams are crazy. Ask if they're crazy enough.
So think about that ad. White lines Gen Z, blue lines millennials, yellow lines Gen X, red lines boomers. Really hard for football players to have that level of picture ID. We ran a study in 2016 comparing the picture ID of the Republican primary field. Turns out like a lot of people confuse Ted Cruz and Marco Rubio, but like literally Tom Brady has the lowest like picture ID because they're used to the helmet, they're used to the jersey. So just think about like how instantaneously, the dials actually start moving with LeBron. They move with Serena Williams. They move obviously with Kaepernick, and they move aggressively when they see Kaepernick on screen. But think about like if you're an executive at Nike and you're trying to think through like how do I make sure that Nike is a relevant and engaged brand with Gen Z, and a lot of areas where you're going to win that level of engagement, you're going to risk serious backlash among Gen X, among boomers, and how you deal with that and how you talk about it. Like for us, this is a great example of why the marketing and insights functions of major companies has to change. It has to be real time. You have to be able to make these types of decisions. You have to know going into this that you're making that decision. If you're the CEO and you're addressing concerns around Nike and the outlook from a forecasting standpoint, reaction to the ad, you want to be empowered to talk to media or to talk to institutional investors about how you've tested it. This is a strategy you're going to take. But all too often you find companies flying blind into this, or they're doing off a 12-person focus group. Think about the Pepsi ad with Kendall Jenner, where she's handing a Pepsi to the police officer. And overnight, Twitter explodes. The ad actually performed better with African Americans than it did with white Americans. It's not a great soda ad. 25% of people say they have a more negative opinion of Pepsi, but they're flying blind into that study real time. And I think this is what's so interesting about where the technology goes, but also just how treacherous the environment is from an executive standpoint. Ages 18 to 29 here, so this is combining some millennials and Gen Z, but this is the pre and the post campaign. So this is literally in the before and after related to the ad campaign. They went up with that 18 to 29 demographic, core demo for where they're looking at. They improved among African Americans, but you can see big jumps, like here's that Trump voter effect. So to me, I think what we find so powerful and exciting about the work we do and the technology we do is it's data that informs better decisions, whether you're looking at it from a policy perspective, whether you're looking at it from a business perspective. And it's been interesting to follow these brands, and the brands sometimes that you don't expect, like IHOP, I don't think I would have expected to see on this list, versus some of the brands that really are more divisive maybe than you even realize. So that's a long monologue. Hopefully there's a couple laughs. I'd love to open it up for discussion or any Q&A.
It appears we have time for one question.
All
We
right.
have a question here in the back.
I'll be quick about this, but I'm glad to know you lined up in front of Stephen Pirani's office too, because I did too. But at any rate, My question is this. I testify in the House and Senate quite often for a law firm. And we, in the legacy funds especially, found out that over the years, most recent, there's more demographic groups, or not demographic, but ethnic groups. And so do you divide your surveys up by ethnic groups a lot of times? Second question is, we had some big media news in this market yesterday. Gannett, Carol Levin was sold along with all the Gannett stations in USA Today and that for $104 billion. Would you care to comment on that, please?
Yeah, we don't even track USA Today. Yeah, I think here I'll grab like the New York Times, for instance. So in this case, if I grab the New York Times, this is actually the platform, real time. So every day, 200 interviews per day for 3,700 brands across 12 countries. And we want a representative sample, and then we want to be able to have much more subpopulation related data. I'll do Nike and I'll show you the media piece on top of this, but just because we were talking about Nike before. So we'll track Nike, we'll track Nike Jordan. In this case, if I click on the data lab, this shows you writ large over time, the overall favorability in Nike. So there's some natural oscillations as different sample sizes go. Here it is versus like Under Armour. If I wanted to show you like this could be the stock price, or in this case, like this is Twitter. So it shows you like the scale of events. So if we zoom in on this will show you like in this case, like this is a major event for Nike. Totally different than those bars, that's the number of Twitter mentions. The lines are the overall favorability of the company. But to your specific question about representation, we don't want to have a stacked sample one way or the other. We're not going to wait on we're not going to field surveys based on party ID, because people might vote differently from election to election. What we want is a representative sample. We want it by age, by education, by gender, by income, by ethnicity, by region of the country. So that really starts as the foundation. We know what those target populations are based on the current population survey by the US Census. That's why you saw kind of the debate over the census was so heated in terms of how companies use market research data. But then what we do on the back end of that is we're waiting. So your hope is that you can go find this totally representative population the very first time. You're never gonna exactly nail the US population, but what you wanna be able to do is use much smaller weights. And that's actually what happened in 2016 with a lot of the political polling. A lot of the old school newspapers, like at USA Today, they're gonna rely on a survey research approach, which is live telephone based. Really hard to reach Hispanic, African American, millennials, Gen Z through live telephone calls. And so you're gonna have to add extra weights to those respondents, and so it can skew samples. But what I think is really cool about this is it doesn't mean those are the only 6 questions you can ask. If you have somebody, in this case, like we have, the average survey length is 20 minutes, we have them from 18 to 22 minutes, so we're gonna ask them questions like, what industry do you work in? So this would show you like, what do people think of Nike who work in the retail industry? Or like, what do they think of, or how are they viewed among people who use Amazon.com daily, or Instagram, or watch ESPN, or live in the Minneapolis, St. Paul MSA. And in that way, to your point about like specific subpopulations, the only way you can do this is if you talk to a lot of people. And that's the thing that's hurting companies, and I think hurting a lot of the survey market research field is today, and it's a little hard to see on the screen, but we've done 224,776 interviews on Nike. It's actually about 10 to 11 times as many interviews as Nike had done on Nike. Turns out you get a phone call from the global head of insights really quick when you release the dial test. But I think what's happening, and this gets to your second question with media, is that people fail to understand what media companies can be. The entire dichotomy has been you either sell advertising content, and for the record, it wasn't Facebook that killed newspapers. Craigslist crushed newspapers. Facebook and Google just came around for what was left of the advertising business model. And then secondly, you have content subscriptions. And so there is a market for a content subscription piece. I think the problem for most media companies is they still think those are the only 2 ways in which the world operates. Today, the most valuable media company with the most sustainable business model is Bloomberg. It doesn't have to only be an ad-supported content or a content subscription. The way we think about media is we think about it as audiences. The mandate to our newsroom is you are there to inform executive decision makers, either in government, in industry, in the nonprofit community, help them be better at their job. We're not there to build the best cat listicle of gifts. Like, that's just not what we do. And so we're not gonna build a business model to do that. But today, like, I think the problem is that most people, when they look at journalism or they look at those spaces, they're so focused on, am I behind a paywall? Am I not behind a paywall? How many people viewed the page? How many people clicked on the page? I actually, I don't care about our page views, because the people who can spend money on the platform, they're gonna spend at least $10,000 a month. And so I need to be able to inform an elite decision maker. I don't want you to dumb it down. I want you to use the acronyms. I want you to talk like how the industry talks. But if you look at media today, it still looks and feels like the 1970s, when you essentially had oligopolies in each of these communities. I think what's got to change in terms of, like, when you look at media consolidation is the way in which this, to Kay Husband's feelings credit, like, how do you look at industry analysis and regulation? Should you evaluate a media company or a media market based on traditionally local television or local newspapers, or are you looking at it in a different market? And if you view more expansively the size of the market, some of that consolidation probably creates synergy in terms of the type of news media gathering that might happen in a print newsroom or digital newsroom might also be very similar and synergistic to what happens in a television newsroom. That isn't to say that, like, it's not important to have very wide diversification. It's just the point that I think, if I leave on a media note, it's just that people should think differently about what media is. And they should do so with a thoughtfulness of both how do you build a sustainable business model, but also, like, what's the responsibility of media? At the end of the day, like, it's our readers that are able to make decisions. The concern writ large for national media is we have the benefit of we write to a highly educated, highly engaged community that can call BS. In the case of, like, the average American, they might not be as educated or as engaged on some of these different pieces. And so I think I could do another hour just on media consolidation. But thank you for the time. It was really a pleasure.